name is Edward Luce. I'm the Financial Times columnist and editorial writer based here in Washington. I have written a book, a rather depressing book called Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline, which deals with some of these issues. I do, though, feel outnumbered. I'm an amateur relative to this panel, so I'm not going to talk.
Great article on Monday.
Oh, good. Yeah, well, I fully agree with you on that point. Yeah,
that was an incredible article.
Bullseye, absolutely correct. But I wanted to make a couple of remarks, really picking up from the excellent panel and presentation by Mariana this morning. The first is, I think, just to sort of balance it out a little bit, entrepreneurialism, innovation, and so forth is also about the private sector. It's also about individuals taking risks. And I think the United States, we'd all agree, is probably, in terms of its cultural DNA, the most risk-taking culture in the world. It's one of the only very few cultures, and the most in this regard, that you can go bankrupt and boast about it. You don't hang your head with shame or hang yourself from the ceiling fan. And I think that's an important point to make, that in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a secular decline in new business formation in the United States. And it predates the 07-08 financial crisis, and it's continued on after the 07 and 08 financial crisis. There are many potential explanations for this, but as discussing with a couple of people earlier, it's a bit like, wondering where the bees are going. There is a mystery as to why it's in such headlong decline. Demographics are obviously a part of it. Lack of access in the financial sector to capital is clearly a part of it. Sarbanes-Oxley is clearly a part of it. The cost of bringing business to market and of compliance with being a regulated listed company. All of these things are a part of it. But there's clearly something going on out there amongst small business, new business, entrepreneurial Americans that is an additional part of this conversation. That was just the sort of first thing I wanted to emphasize. And the second is, and final thing, is I thought Mariana's presentation was excellent. It's very rare that you get that much thought-provoking and information stuff crammed into such a short, with the Italian passion that you presented it. I was really, really impressed with your presentation and with your book. And I basically agree with your premise. But again, just to try and sort of bring a different dimension to this, as a journalist, as a correspondent, you're often asked a good question to ask yourself if you're based in a foreign country, which I am, technically, is what's the one big question you want answered about that country? And my colleague in China, I posed this question to. He said, can China innovate? And I think the answer, of course, three millennia of history shows that it can. But right now, can China innovate? Can it turn these vast investments that it's pumping into R&D, into clean tech and so forth, into real commercial innovation on the global stage? And I think that's probably the right uber question for him to be asking. The question I would ask, and this is relating back to Mariana's presentation, is about America, is can America govern itself? And that, of course, is relevant at the federal level, very, very relevant to everything Mariana's been talking about. Alan Wolf, I think, gave a very interesting presentation, as did Dean, and he mentioned Sematech, the partnership in the 80s during the Reagan era between the semiconductor industry and government. And I think that was probably the last time America has seen anything resembling a consciously designed industrial policy. And it was a roaring success, So successful that nobody would even dare breathe a word of an industrial policy since then. It's taboo. So my sort of uber question to Mariana, and I hope the panel will address this too, is since we agree, well, I certainly agree with the premise of what you're arguing, and I'm sure Bill and Ruth do, at least with some of it. How do you think you can change the politics in this country to definancialize the economy, to have industrial policies, to smart ones, targeted ones, to have an entrepreneurial bureaucracy, given what people think about government in this country? Last night I had a very long interview on Capitol Hill with Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee, who's, if you don't know, is a Tea Party senator. But he's at the more thoughtful end. He's, if you like, a sort of thinking man's libertarian. And his view of government and what government can and can't do is not some wacko 5% proportion of the population here. Basically, government is the dead hand wherever it is. It represents a very broad strain in American political culture. How then can the very, very salient things that you've been recommending, Mariana, about creating an entrepreneurial state, how then do we actually get from A to B? And just the last sort of point on that, as you mentioned, that fascinating example of Telsa getting a $500 million guaranteed loan from the Obama administration. Of course, Solyndra getting the same amount. Nobody knows about Telsa. Everybody knows about Solyndra. Now, partly you can blame the communications policy of the White House, that they're just not good at emphasizing what they do. But I think partly it's the receptivity of people. You know, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. And people just don't hear. They just don't register that government can do constructive, entrepreneurial, innovative things. However many times you tell them about the iPhone, they see Steve Jobs, and that's it. So my sort of uber question that I hope you'll address is, if we agree on the premise of Mariana's case, how are we going to get there? How do we do the politics? So with that, let me ask Ruth David first to give a sort of short, keep it relatively short if you could. Ruth, I mean, you've got the bios, but the most interesting bit of your bio is CIA. That always sort of flashes up at me.
Actually, I've spent 2 hours trying to figure out why I'm here. I'm a techie. I am not an economist. I am not a policy person. I'm a techie. But I will say in the last decade more, I've had a chance to gain, I would say, a more global perspective than certainly from where I started, which was at a nuclear weapons engineering lab. And that has opened my eyes in many, many ways. I want to share with you a couple of quick anecdotes because, to me, they frame the issue in a different way. One of our earlier speakers mentioned Taiwan and its quest to become the best foundry and the best in semiconductor manufacturing. I was in Taiwan about 6 months ago and talking to senior officials in that business, and they were wringing their hands literally because their semiconductor manufacturing sector had moved to the mainland in search of low-cost labor. And they were saying, we have to reshape our value proposition. We have to move ourselves up the value chain because we cannot compete with the low-cost labor. And I thought, I could have been sitting in California and listening to that kind of a comment. Another quick example, I had an opportunity to talk to a very young entrepreneur in our own Silicon Valley. And he shared with me, he's Chinese national, Stanford educated, bright young man. His wife, also a Chinese national, opted to become a US citizen. He did not. The reason is it is to his benefit to do his startup in China. He has no intention to leave Silicon Valley. He wants to live, he and his wife want to live in California, but from an incentive and policy perspective, it is to his benefit to do his startup in China. I think that paints a picture that I find personally very frightening. One of our earlier speakers mentioned that Russia's launch of the Sputnik basically drove us to create DARPA and invest hugely in science and technology. My question is, where's the sense of urgency today? You know, we publish statistics which are lagging indicators for science and engineering, which is a bit like the frog in the warm pot of water. We maybe haven't reached the boiling state yet. And there's a large measure, I believe, of complacency about where we are. We don't look effectively at the trends. The SCI, the Science and Engineering Indicators just published, had a whole summary section on commitment to innovation from a global perspective. And they had, I think on the one page, 6 different charts. And many of those charts, the US look good. We still spend more than anyone else. Now, if you look at spend relative to economic output, we're sort of middle of the pack. But the chart that caught my attention was one that looked 15 years ago and today, relative investment in R&D by region. 15 years ago, North America had a commanding lead. In 15 years, Asia has taken the lead, and they weren't even in second place 15 years ago. That kind of movement, because they were 15% behind 15 years ago, that kind of movement ought to get our attention, but it doesn't seem to do so. But your challenge is, what do we do differently? Because I'm a techie, from Mariana's talk, I came at that and said, that's just systems thinking. You've got to develop policy that looks holistically at the outcome you're trying to motivate. You raised a couple of perfect examples, healthcare being one. Our policy doesn't look at the totality of the problem, and you mentioned the notion of investing in drugs versus investing in keeping people healthy from the start. So it's bringing in that behavioral aspect, the societal aspects, into shaping a policy. Similarly, in the energy arena, several have mentioned the role of the consumer in the energy problem. So to the extent that we continue to write policy that only looks very narrowly, very incrementally at a problem, I don't believe we can achieve the outcomes that we aspire to create. And to me, that's a big part of fueling innovation with a vector that addresses more holistically some of these systemic problems. I'm going to stop there.
Perfect, and admirably concise and to the point. Thank you, Bill. I know you're also admirably concise. A wonderful person to. Yeah, it was an incentive. It was thank you in advance kind of introduction. Bill, of course, is head of MIT here in the office here in Washington, which is a perfect vantage point to talk about the intersection of private and public. Please keep it to 5 minutes.
Sure, and you can cut me off to it. Let me just build, on Ruth's point about systems thinking. I've been doing a great deal of work lately on advanced manufacturing. MIT just put out a major study in the last few months about the kind of manufacturing side, and I just wanted to kind of frame that as part of this kind of innovation debate. The first point I'd like to make is that manufacturing really needs to be seen, particularly initial production, as part of the innovation system. We typically think of it in the United States as an afterthought, that it's something that's kind of on automatic pilot, but it's a very creative stage, an enormous amount of engineering, and often the rethinking of the innovation so it can fit into a market niche has to occur in that early production stage. And our failure to do that, to sort of think of it as part of the innovation system, I think is pretty problematic, particularly since production, is a key creator of increasing returns in an economy. A second point is that what have we been doing in manufacturing? Well, the story, I think, in U.S. manufacturing, as the MIT report summarizes, is that we've been kind of thinning out the ecosystem. We have lost a little less than 1/3 of our manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010. We thought the reason was productivity gains, but it turns out that we have actually been facing a real hollowing out of the system, including output declines in some very key sectors. So that system is thinning out. What's going on there? The MIT study concludes that we've had a financial services model that's driven us towards things like core competency and asset-light models for risk reduction and shorter-term returns. And that in turn has forced major companies to kind of de-integrate in a way, to become less vertical and less connected with the smaller and mid-sized firms. So that increasingly the smaller and mid-sized firms are more home alone, as the MIT report puts it. And that the depth of the ecosystem that used to be supportive of that whole system in areas like training, in areas like developing best practices, in areas like bringing the most advanced technology in, has really thinned out significantly. Another point is that we've got a problem when we come to the moment of financing the scale-up of production. The MIT report studied small and mid-sized firms in the US and conducted numerous in-depth interviews really across the country, focused on 4 very different states with very different manufacturing economies. It found that with the end of local banking, which has been replaced by national and indeed international banking models, that the historic relation between the local bank and the small and mid-sized firms that used to provide support for those small and mid-sized firms when they came across an innovation that they wanted to scale up, that's really in decline. So that the scale-up process has to be funded out of ongoing revenues, which means that it's really slowed down. At the same time, when other countries, and China's the leading example, have worked on building a very rapid scale-up process for new production. And then on the entrepreneurial startup firms, kind of the next generation of US technology leadership, increasingly, they're not able to get the financing for this initial production either when they're trying to make something that if you dropped it on your foot, you'd feel it, not just software. So those firms can often get initial venture funding, but that venture funding is not large enough to extend to scaling up production for any kind of reasonable capital kind of good. And there's a real gap there, and typically they are now driven offshore to contract manufacturers abroad, which means that that very important initial production stage is shifting with all the engineering know-how that's particularly important for the next stages of incremental advance moves as well. A fourth point is that, how are we going to respond to this? What are we going to deal with here? And we've thought for years that the kind of macroeconomic policies of trade and tax and regulation and currency valuation are kind of the core here. But the thrust of a number of recent studies, including the MIT report and reports out of PCAST, has been that the US retains an innovation advantage. Let's put that innovation system to work, because without further productivity gains and efficiencies, the US manufacturing system is not going to be able to compete. So it's not that the macro policies are bad, but it's that an innovation policy is really going to be needed here. And are there some new technology paradigms tied to process and business models that the US could create using its innovation advantage that would help return us to a competitive posture? There's issues about the workforce. Talent is a major input into any innovation system. And we've got a real talent gap, particularly given the demographics of an aging workforce in manufacturing and the need to get to these new advanced manufacturing paradigms that's going to require us to address our talent pool. Germany has a lot of interesting models for us. Some are translatable, some are not. But they do the connections between their firms and build these ecosystems and strengthen their ecosystems in ways that we've kind of lost track of through Fraunhofers and other devices. Maybe there's some lessons there. They probably have the strongest skilled labor force training system in the world. Maybe there's some lessons there. Because Germany pays 60% or more higher wages than the US, but runs a huge surplus in manufactured goods, including with China, which is almost unthinkable here. So maybe they prove to an American public that thinks that just because the US is high wage and high cost, that we can't compete abroad. Germany is considerably higher cost and competes brilliantly. And sort of a closing point I'd like to make is that there's a big jobs issue here. Increasingly, manufacturing firms, to be successful, are tying a tradable good, a high-value good, to a high-value service. You produce the good, but you also create the service support that enables it to be a solution to a customer's problem. And that way you benefit not only from the good, but from the service. And over half of the value of US manufactured goods exports is now in the services side. So this is an increasing model that we're pursuing here. The tradable good gets tied to what becomes a tradable service. Now, most services are still face-to-face and don't scale. But if a tradable good scales, and if you can tie it to a tradable service, that scales as well. The importance here is that US is an 80% services economy. the future of our services economy strength may depend upon creating more tradable services. And if the key to doing that is around tradable goods, we've got to pay attention to manufacturing innovation.
Thank you very much. Again, admirably concise and to the point. Let me ask my Uber question by putting it this way. If you did a poll, and I'll put it first to you, Mariana, if you did a poll of Americans or indeed people around the world about whether the US is innovative, they would probably say it's at the most innovative phase ever. When you talk about self-driving cars, you talk about what we can do on the internet nowadays and in the palm of our hand. So getting Americans to worry about innovation would strike me as a very, very difficult proposition politically. You mentioned Sputnik and the concentrating effect that had on public minds. People ask, where is the moonshot nowadays? I think the preceding and more important question is, where is the Sputnik? What will be the Sputnik that's going to change the politics, that's going to get the kinds of things? Mariana, I know this is sort of straying into pure politics, but could you sort of think outside?
Yeah, but can I also answer the way you posed it in the beginning, which I thought was very important, which is the problem just a lack of information? You know, people just don't know? Or is it that they don't want to know even if you throw the information at them? And I think that's a really important way to put it because, well, I think it's both, but there is a lack of information. I mean, even just the words that were used, regardless of one's position, right? So I'm going to say this sort of apolitically, on Obamacare, regardless of whether you think it's good or bad, how it was talked about. So the government meddling in your health care. What Obama should have done, if he wanted to do that, was literally get helicopters and, you know, put down those little pieces of paper with just some numbers of what the US government's role is in healthcare products, right? So this issue about that without the government, you wouldn't actually even have these drugs, right? So it's not just about the government regulating, meddling, administering, taxing, but creating. I actually don't think that information's out there. People do not know. You know, we know, but this is a little elite group about this NIH spending, you know, $32 billion and responsible for that. But the same thing in Europe, and you know, because it's a global economy, what happens in Europe completely affects the US. I don't think people know. Or let's just say they've been bombarded with a different view of what causes a difference between Germany and Greece, right? So the view that has been completely bombarded is that Germany, you know, benefited from the Schroeder reforms in the 1990s when wages were sort of tapped while productivity was increasing. And they sort of, in some ways, cheated then when the euro came in because of their internal exchange rate. No one says that actually the massively skewed competitiveness in Europe, where you really have this periphery, the Greece, the Portugals, the Italys, and the core is actually because of investment. So, you know, the patient long-term finance through the KfW, these Fraunhofer institutes, the high R&D spending, and the fact that R&D spending is actually directed towards these missions, which really do galvanize excitement, is what allows Germany to produce the goods that the world wants to buy. So Germany wins procurement contracts in the UK to build trains, right? Siemens just won a big contract, and that's not because, you know, Siemens workers are being paid very little, you just said, right? They're being paid more. It's because Siemens is one of the most innovative companies in the world, especially to build modern, fast, green trains. Now, that sort of set of numbers, and there's plenty of numbers there, and how much, you know, because the problem is not finance, there's plenty of finance. There's no lack of finance, there's a lack of patient, long-term committed finance, which both the KfW and the Landesbanks provide. There's all sorts of numbers that one could be bombarding the, you know, European people out there that shows that that's the difference between Germany and Greece. Those numbers are not bombarded. Or if you want, you don't hear that in the media. I mean, I actually often go on TV and just feel very lonely. My fellow sort of progressive economists don't go enough on TV to make that argument that that's the difference.
So if you
and
keep
repeating
the truth often enough, people will believe
Well, there's
it.
not enough courageous, I mean, I don't even call them lefty economists, because what we're actually arguing for is proper capitalism. I mean, we could also argue, you know, if one wanted to, for socialism, but what we're arguing here is to have an innovation-led dynamic capitalism. You actually need these kind of investments.
We'll get back to that in a minute, but sorry, Bill, you wanted to...
Yeah, just to build on your question a little bit and add to the prior points. You know, we've been waiting for the next Sputnik for a long time. And I'm not sure we're going to get one. In other words, a precipitating crisis moment. You know, we have much more of a frog in the, you know, boiling pot of water that doesn't know it's dying kind of problem. And, you know, the country is typically mobilized by crisis. Democracies are typically mobilized only by crisis. But we're not going to have that luxury, I fear. So I think part of the story is telling the story. But part of it is to kind of recognize how the U.S. system works and kind of work within that structure to try and, move in some ongoing incremental steps as well. I mean, as many folks in this room know, the United States runs two parallel innovation systems, right? We run a defense innovation system that does the research, does the development, does the prototype, does the demonstration, does the test bed, and often provides an initial market. So we have an industrial policy system in place on the defense side that worked very well with all the investments during the Cold War and brought us a slew of technologies, often originating in DARPA, into the economy. We've got a system on the civilian side of the universe, which is the majority of our R&D investment, that's very, very focused on just the front end. But the model we've typically used to move a little towards the back end in that system has been the public-private partnerships, where industry provides leadership, as frankly I think it should, structurally, but certainly within our political system. And it may be that we can extend that public-private partnership model into some territories. Maybe we can extend it, for example, into helping to support the development and the R&D behind some of these new potential technology paradigms in advanced manufacturing, which we're starting to think about.
Ruth, you want to chip in?
Let's see, we've talked about Sputnik as a catalyzing event. I would argue 9/11 was yet another Sputnik moment. It was a catalyzing event in some good, lots of bad ways for us. Katrina was yet another. We do, as a nation, tend to go from crisis to crisis and react in the immediate aftermath of what we term a crisis. So how do we get beyond that? I think one of Mariana's points, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my terms, we need different indicators. We need to change the conversation. We need to be able to tell the story differently, because I think we too often do look in the rearview mirror, rely on decades of statistics, and say, it's not so bad. It's not so bad. And so are there new measures that we can begin to create and put forward that bring in the dynamics, the complexity that is occurring today, that is not just a linear extrapolation of the past, but rather acknowledges the emergence that is occurring around us in the global marketplace. I don't think we have cracked the code on telling that story in a way that creates a sense of urgency. And to me, I think that's a piece of what's missing, because we're not even having the conversation.
So another way to ask the question, again, I'll pose it first to Mariana, is your point about patient capital, and that there is less patient. Capital is more impatient nowadays. I used to write speeches for Larry Summers, and he'd say quite often that patient capital is dumb capital, or he'd have that view. I don't agree with him. But that's the conventional wisdom. And the idea that the state can play a role, say setting up a public innovation bank, or even a public infrastructure bank, is a very difficult one to get to. My question to you, and I'd like all three of you to answer, is where, when you look around the world at these entrepreneurial states and at the development of this consciousness of what a state can do, where do you find, other than Germany, where do you find good examples that could be used here to sort of stimulate the imagination in terms of the debate in Washington? Where do you find, where are the models?
Well, I wouldn't say they're perfect, but the two countries that come to mind are China and Brazil, not because they're perfect, but because of what's happening there is that the micro strategy, the innovation industrial strategy, and the macro strategy are actually lined up. So when they're lined up, the potential for actually getting this stuff right? Because the details always sound good. I mean, even in the UK, everything it's trying to do with innovation sounds great, but then why doesn't it work? Because it's completely, and I've been told not to use the word schizophrenic. I used it on TV, and I got 30 emails from the Mental Health Society saying, don't you ever use that word. I had to think of a better, what's another word for completely incoherent, if you want, right? And just quickly, just coming to Europe again, at the level of the Commission, right, because I work a lot with them, there's different DGs, okay? So there's no lack of innovation spending. There's 80 billion euros now in the Horizon 2020 program, which is going to be spent on research and innovation. So it sounds great. Well, guess what? It's not great, because then you have the other DG, the macro guys, ECFIN, which are basically the finance ministries in terms of the pressure, causing pressure for countries like Spain to cut publicly funded R&D since 2009 by 40%. That's a huge amount, right? So they are not going to become like Germany. And as long as you have this huge skewed competitiveness in Europe, none of the monetary policy, the common fiscal policy, or these innovation policies will work. So China and Brazil, what I just find fascinating, and I mean, I go there and I kind of get goosebumps, at least in Brazil, which doesn't mean everything's fine, right? There are demonstrations in the streets, there's all sorts of issues. But if you hear what they're saying, they're trying to do innovation and poverty alleviation at the same time, right? So it really requires to do both of those things, bringing together the macro and the micro. And China as well. I mean, again, there's huge problems, but have you looked at the numbers of how many people have been pulled out of poverty? Of course, there's all sorts of other numbers that are worrying. In order to do some of the green stuff, they're taking land away from people. So it's not about having just a rosy, blind picture of what's happening in China, but the dynamism and the trajectory is fascinating because of the micro and the macro. And just one quick thing, I mean, there's this agency here in the US government called NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, and they do incredible research that I don't think is well known enough. There's actually a paper called Beyond the Business Cycle, which I think is really good, by Gregory Tassi, which really argues, even though the evidence isn't really there, but it kind of sounds like it's there, which is that it's not enough to just dig ditches and fill them up again, right? This is what Keynes was saying, and during the Great Depression, just saying, my God, do anything, just dig a hole and fill it up, it'll create jobs. Actually, that doesn't create jobs in the long run, maybe just in the short run. What creates jobs in the long run is when these kind of investments are actually directed, kind of coming back to what I was saying before, and the multiplier, the Keynesian multiplier, the fiscal multiplier is like 3 times as high when you do something, directed, which doesn't mean just offshore wind, it means having a green strategy. And the green strategy is a Sputnik moment. I mean, again, look at the figures on irreversibility, the permafrost. That is scary as hell. That is worse than any Cold War. I mean, we are in deep, am I allowed to say shit? No, in deep, 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 deep shit. If this stuff doesn't happen in 10 years. I mean, we don't have, like when I said before, innovation takes a long time, 15 to 20 years, we don't even have 20 years. There's going to be irreversibility. I mean, that word, it should scare the hell out of everyone, and that should be the Sputnik moment.
Bill, Ruth, do you agree we're in deep shit?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Couldn't resist. You gave me license.
Absolutely, I do. I absolutely do.
You don't think this is being overstated? Again, I'll go back to the popular opinion of the level of innovation that's going on, what this can do for health, what this can do for transport, what this can do for education. Is it completely wrong, conventional wisdom? There are extraordinary things going on, and they're coming out of America.
Absolutely.
I mean, let me just challenge the conventional wisdom here, which I mostly agree with. How could you deny the sort of efflorescence of innovations that are going on, and the fact they're coming from here, mostly?
Coming from here to where? Where are they going? At the risk of quoting Norm Augustine when he's not here to defend himself, he, a couple of years ago now, observed that the NRC report that he helped drive, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, that spawned the Competes Act and other things, he shared with me he'd been all over the world talking about that report, and that there was more action taken as a result of that report elsewhere than there was here. So I think it is absolutely wonderful that we are spawning entrepreneurs and innovation, but are they benefiting us or others disproportionately? That's my question. And not only that, what is the trend?
Bill, you've been based here a long time, and you've worked with these agencies, NSF and NIST, and people I'm sure like Greg Tassi, who Mariana mentioned. The perception is that they're becoming more bureaucratic, of the NIH, that grants are becoming more tied, shorter term, that the basic research that's funded, the R&D that's funded by the federal government, is becoming less and less serendipitous, less and less sort of freewheeling. Is the truth to that? And if so, what's the remedy?
Well, there is a tendency in the peer review process, which governs, most of our R&D awards, that when you get the number of applications to for a particular R&D award up to more than about 5 applicants for each award, it gets more cautious. The willingness of peer review panels to fund the wilder stuff declines. It's a well-known tendency. But it's also a tendency that most of the agencies understand and are trying to take some steps by kind of reserving a certain amount of funding for kind of out-of-the-box stuff to offset. That tendency will continue to grow as U.S. R&D investment continues to stagnate. So it's one that we have to be very careful and watch. I mean, the solution to it is to get the investment levels, back to, frankly, where they should be and get us on a growth path on the R&D innovation investment side. But, there are out-of-the-box agencies that live off doing breakthrough work. And I think it's fair to say that a place like DARPA or a place like ARPA-E, a different kind of R&D model, are alive and well and still, pushing at the frontier.
Mariana?
Well, just coming back to the point of the others that are benefiting. I mean, it depends what you mean by others, but what I meant when I said inclusive growth, I mean in Silicon Valley what's happened to the public school system, right? Those are the others. The taxpayers, in the broad definition of the word, the U.S. public is not necessarily benefiting because of how, the stuff is done. And I can't remember who said that, we need tax reform, and I'm not some sort of, commie who's saying, let's just bring it up to 100%. But, do you know what it was under Eisenhower? The real top marginal rate, Republican president, it was close to 90.
92.
Yeah. So, and the point is not to go back to that. The point is to say, what happened since then? Was it just random shocks in the policy that made it fall? No. It was actually a discussion and a capture, I think, of this whole innovation debate, which I think now just we almost have to start from scratch and actually use evidence. I mean, I always say that my little community of innovation scholars, we should have in our pockets, and we don't have it. So we just, talk. Every time you have a crisis, the first thing that you do to inspire growth is cut corporate income tax, cut different types of taxes, do the tax incentives, with this assumption that that's just going to spur this growth. There's no evidence at the sectoral level, right, and this is the kind of studies we do, that those types of policies affect investment, let alone innovation. Instead, what they have been doing is fueling inequality. Now, it actually takes courage to talk about that, because I can tell you, everyone likes to talk about innovation. I haven't met anyone who says to me, oh, God, you're doing such a boring thing. Everyone's, oh, how interesting, innovation. As soon as you start talking about these things, coming back to my first point, you kind of get a little tense. And I'm not saying I have the answer to what should happen to tax. I'm just saying that has to be part of the discussion, and it's not about just tax incentives. And until we do that, this others thing is a huge issue. I mean, read Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah, piece in The New Yorker on Silicon Valley public schools. And it's not just about, again, what's that tax that they have to pay there for schools? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's also just about this complete lack of thinking about this, innovation is collective, it's uncertain, and it's cumulative. Those 3 fundamental characteristics about it should be informing us, both in terms of the innovation policies, but also these other policies in terms of inclusive growth. And I already talked before about the cumulative issue, that the capture is larger, but the collective part, if it's true that it's collective, let's really think about that.
We talk a little bit, and we'll go to questions in 1 minute. Final one from me about R&D policy here for the private sector. You mentioned earlier that you thought it was fairly useless, this annual tax credit. Well, not as useful as it's presented. I mean, I spent time with a couple of large pharma companies and looked at their R&D budgets. And their R&D budgets are essentially about compliance, clinical trials. They're not about basic research. And so it's a bit of a myth. When you see the global number of what the US private sector spends on R&D, I think it's $330 billion, something of that order. It's a huge,
$1 billion per drug is what they say.
Most of it is D, not R. So what, if anything, can the tax system here in Washington, D.C., the federal tax system, do usefully to stimulate more basic research from the private sector? Because clearly that's got to be a part of the answer, hasn't it?
There's an interesting effort by an economist at MIT named Andrew Lowe, who's looking at this whole issue. And he has a wonderful chart. The chart shows historic home prices in the United States since 1880. And, it's give or take a, recession, depression or two. It's essentially a flat line until about 1990, and then it becomes a hockey stick, right? It just goes to the ceiling. And we develop, a huge set of innovations in the financial services side that enabled securitization and, frankly, a global financial services market. And we selected the investment was going to be, mortgages and home mortgages and commercial real estate, right? So we created a huge bubble. Andrew's point is that it's not that the financial services capability and securitization is wrong. It's that maybe we could create some incentives to drive the, $35 trillion, whatever the number is, debt markets in the world towards some of these societal investments that we might want to undertake. And then you've got to build a portfolio model around risk to support some of these early stage investments. But he's actually making progress on trying to think through what that risk model might be, that if you had a wide enough investment portfolio and it was large enough, investments in earlier stage research actually make sense from the private sector. So I'm not sure the money is going to come from the federal government to do this. It's going to be a hard case to make. I think we need to look at some of the creative things that may be possible on the financial services side.
Mm-hmm. Ruth?
Yeah, this is I think is a very tough question because it is true that the government in the U.S. is still the predominant investor in basic research. Most of what industry does is D today. The big corporate research labs are largely gone. That said, if you talk to CEOs in industry and ask them where they are building the research facilities that they are building, it's not in the U.S. And when you probe that a bit, I hear consistently three reasons for that. One is increasingly having a research facility in another country gives them access to markets that they might not otherwise have access to. Two is it gives them access to talent, and this goes back to our school system, our education, our whole workforce issue. And three, it gives them access to other incentives and policy regimes, which other countries are willing to ante up. So I don't believe the U.S. can look at a policy in this area without acknowledging that our companies are increasingly competing in a global market. And frankly, in addition to their own research facilities, a lot of their basic research is acquired. So in a sense, it's outsourced. They find a young startup who's got a novel idea, they buy it. So they don't have a steady stream of research investment. They simply buy the innovation and assimilate it. Mm-hmm. So it's just a very different model than the days of Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, and those sorts of institutions.
I'm wondering whether public policy can stimulate a renaissance in that model, though.
I don't know.
That's my question.
I don't know.
And if so, what it is?
I would argue it needs to be rethought in a global context. And I don't know what that looks like, but it's an interesting experiment.
Should we go to questions? Sorry. Do you take them sort of all collectively, or do you do one by one? Do you have a house style here?
Three at a time.
Why don't you take a few of them since we're beginning to get up to the...
Okay, so starting with this gentleman and then...
Yes, thank you for a great panel. I'm Albert Keidel. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, but I'm former U.S. Treasury Department China Asia manager. I have two quick questions. One, Sputnik. One of the reasons China is not playing a Sputnik role is because it's being pictured as a cheater, that they're only succeeding because they're really breaking the rules. And that seems to me detrimental to U.S. efforts to try to figure out what really is happening, because if we could emphasize instead that China's really doing a lot of things right, then we have to look at ourselves and say, well, now, what do we need to do right to get there? The other thing has to do with religion, which is Adam Smith. It seems to have really swept America in a fanatical way, and at the expense of someone like Friedrich List, who pointed out that Adam Smith really missed the ball just focusing on competition and efficiency and ignored how to create the productive forces in society. And so someone has to sort of take that head on and say, Adam Smith really is not the best picture, despite all the pins and neckties and so forth, for an economy like that in the modern world today. Instead, we need an emphasis not just on the invisible hand, but on what I think Mariana was talking about, a collective hand, where we are a unit and we need to work together as a unit, even if you want to call it a global unit, but not say this, leave the government out of it. That's a big mistake. We need to develop our productive forces. And so there's a religious issue that just needs to be taken on head on.
Did you have a question?
My question is, what are the chances of really changing our approach to China? It takes a political will that is opposed, it seems to me, by a lot of special interests who benefit from blaming China.
Thank you. And we'll take one from you, sir.
I'm, again, Marco Di Capo. I was former science counselor at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi and U.S. Embassy in Beijing. I have a question here. The sense of the panel is that perhaps the glass is half empty. To what degree we could consider the glass half full if we were able to establish an accounting system by which there is a public goods account ledger in the government, where basically which is equivalent to the goodwill ledger in corporations, where you can actually would be able to account for the fact that there is a GPS that's being supplied, that there is a infrastructure network that communication infrastructure that tremendously facilitated business. Or on the negative side is that we're using air that is apparently for free, that we're using air that is never really accounted in air-breathing engines, that is never really accounted in the capital goods in the capital goods account of the country, because we're depleting the capital goods accounting. So to what degree we need to change the government accounting system to actually take care of public goods? Mariana, in your book, you say there's 6 instances where public goods appears in your index. I haven't read your book yet, but I wanted to know what the sense of the panel is in terms of the public goods account of countries like the United States.
Okay, we'll deal with these questions and then go to others after having dealt with these two. So China and changing how you account for public goods. Bill.
Just on the China point, one of the, I think, important findings of these recent MIT studies around manufacturing is that China really has developed a quite innovative production system. They are able to bring regional manufacturers collaboratively together so that they're able to scale up goods very quickly. A skill set that seems to be eroding in this country. They're very good at re-engineering technology in a way to fit Chinese markets, but thinking about putting new components and new processes and new materials into a good, which will enable its cost to come down to fit a Chinese market, which also brings on benefits in international markets. They're very good. And there's a lot of subsidies and governmental requirements too built into this, but they're quite good at collaborating with Western firms that bring advanced technologies, and then China works on improvements with them to that. So this is, well, it's not a Sputnik moment because we don't understand it. We think that we're losing to China because they're just a low-cost, low-wage competitor, right? We don't understand that actually they're bringing on some very interesting, sophisticated parts of production. Now, that's not to say that there aren't heavy governmental incentives and subsidies that help this process along, but we do need to understand what China is doing better than we do now. So I think your point is an important one.
Mariana, can you deal with the public goods question?
Yes, is something small about China?
Oh, of course.
Really quick? Okay, I mean, what's really interesting in China is, again, this patient capital stuff, right? So let's just say that we all agree with Schumpeter's point, which is that innovation is at the center of the capitalist system in terms of how firms compete, right? Which, by the way, kills all of neoclassical economics if you really take that seriously, because it kills, the representative agent, whatever. But that's another point. Then, if then the point is that innovation, at least the innovation in areas like clean technology and nanotechs, and not just little gadgets, requires time, 15 to 20 years, then what you need is this patient, long-term committed finance. And if it's also true that we are increasingly not seeing that in the private sector, and you're increasingly having to ask the public sector to provide that, so the whole stuff that I mentioned before in state investment banks, then it actually means that something like the China Development Bank is absolutely fundamental. And then you look at the companies in China which are completely innovative, like Huawei, #1 in the world in telecommunications without the US market. They haven't been allowed in the US. They are #1 anyway, even without the US market. Why have they not been allowed in the US market? Because of, they're anti-competitive. There's also security issues, but also this idea that they got too much money, right? I also have figures of how much money, say, Yingli Green Energy got 1.7 billion from that bank between 2008 and 2012. I have a whole list of companies here that have gotten between 1 and 2 billion single companies from the China Development Bank, which is in fact what Huawei got. The immediate thing to ask is, does this mean we have to actually change the competition rules if we want innovation-led growth? I mean, it depends what kind of growth you want, right? I mean, competition rules should be on the basis of what kind of growth you want. So if you just want growth, for example, based on the Walmart strategy, just pay your workers so little that they all have to get welfare benefits, that's going to lead to a different type of competition strategy than if you say we absolutely need innovation-led growth, which requires this patient capital. Now, I don't want to, again, give an answer. I just want to say having innovation-led growth should then change or affect how you think about competition policy. Instead, what we have is two completely different, I won't say schizophrenic, incoherent conversations between innovation policy and competition policy.
Multiple personality disorder, I think.
Yeah. But in terms of public goods, I mean, the reason I don't talk about it too much in my book is my whole point in the book is to say, and it's kind of crazy because then you hear what the world is talking about, you say, oh shit, I should have actually started off from scratch and explained the whole public good problem. But it's that, it's the public good issue we kind of all know, but actually what's happened in places like Silicon Valley is even much more than that, right? So it's actually trying to open the whole discourse of what the state should be doing and how it should be doing it around mission-oriented investments, which even goes beyond the public good question. But the point about public goods is, what you're basically arguing for, and there is some debate about this in different countries, is that, these kind of investments should not even get counted as debt, just as spending. These are capital expenditures, just like with a company. Now, this is the problem in the Eurozone periphery, is they're being forced to cut all these things, which actually would lead to long-run growth because it's being counted as spending, right? So Spain reducing its public R&D spending by 40% is because they're trying to get into this ridiculous Maastricht criteria of 3% debt to GDP, which not even Germany had before the crisis. But your bigger point, I think, is fundamental, and I just wrote an article on this, I'll send it to you. We talk about how we actually should account for value in GDP measures. It's actually much worse than that. Most of what gets counted into GDP is rent. We no longer have a proper value theory that we used to have basically before the 1930s when we actually talked about value. Then value went from being objective to subjective. Right? This is the whole neoclassical sort of revolution where workers' wages in neoclassical textbooks taught to people all over the world today are related to the preferences that workers have for leisure versus work. Okay? It used to be something else. It was much more objective, related to actually investments. So if you look at bank interest payments, they're included in GDP, both commercial banks and investment banks. Why? The commercial banks, because of financial intermediation, this is seen as a service. We know all the technological changes happen in financial intermediation that should have affected interest rates. It hasn't. And investment banks, because of the supply of risk capital, we know who pays for it in the end, right? The whole bailout shows us that in the end, the real sort of risk is absorbed by these public institutions. If you start taking out of the GDP equation lots of things like that, which are really just transfer payments, that's not value creation. Like a big part of that interest part of GDP is transfer payment. The GDP of the UK would basically fall by 60%. So there's lots of rent included in GDP. And I'm just saying that because actually how we calculate growth is not just that we don't have happiness indicators, all this stuff that people are saying we should include. It's actually that there's lots of rent. So Schumpeterian profits versus Ricardian rent, sorry, that's a bit technical, but it's that bad. But there is a debate about, R&D expenditures should actually be as capital expenditures, but that also, I think, comes down to showing that there's going to be a return. So as long as you have a market failure approach where all you're seen as doing is creating the conditions and not actually making an active investment, which is what I think the US government has always made, active investment, which is very risky, but it also has a huge potential return, the whole internet thing. So the framework you have through which to talk about those investments then determines how they get put into GDP.
I think that's more economics I've heard in 5 minutes. I'm very impressed. I'm really impressed. More, Ruth, sorry. We've got more questions. Sir.
Hedrick Smith, formerly with the New York Times here in Washington. How do you change the incentives so that even if you go back to the good old days of Bell Labs when they came up with the flat panel display innovation, it wound up by being produced by Sharp? Right. Okay, I mean, it moved very quickly. So you were talking earlier about inclusivity as one of your goals with innovation, and all of you have sort of suggested that one way or another. How do you change the incentives here so that, in fact, commercialization, production is part of the incentive for funding innovation?
I think that's a really spot-on question, because it wasn't just Bell Labs, it was Xerox PARC. We can all point to innovations that went elsewhere for the return, if you will. And that, I think, is a piece of, do we have a strategy for the government's basic research investments to bridge the valley of death, as it were, and to make sure that they make it into commercial products in the US? I'll be very parochial here. And I don't think we do. And I think that is in contrast to what I've certainly heard in other countries who have active measures in place to transition basic research discoveries by having almost an incubator approach. I think we have it in some areas, but I think it's much more locally, regionally motivated than it is a well thought out process. So with us, I think it happens almost serendipitously. In other countries, I think there are far more thoughtful approaches to creating incubators, to bringing together the inventors with an infrastructure, a company, or another set of people who can make sure that that product goes into realization and becomes a commercial output. I think we're missing that gap.
Yeah, just to build on Ruth's good points, you know, it's not that the basic research investment is a mistake, right? The level of the basic research investment in the United States has been foundational for being able to allow this country to drive radical technology advance. So it's a crucial foundation stone, but I think the issue is, and as Ruth pointed out earlier, we don't think about innovation as a system, and we really need to think much more systematically. Not only focus on the front end, right, the R&D side, but think about those transition stages. And we've never built the institutional connections across what's known in innovation policy as the valley of death, between research and late-stage development. And what are the institutional elements that we could help pull together? I do think that the collaborative public-private partnership, regionally based, provides a lot of those answers, because in the end, you know, innovation is like real estate. You know, it's location, location, location. And the collections of talent and capabilities that develop regionally in this country is a critical asset. And how do we spur those as bridge mechanisms?
Mariana.
I mean, I would almost say the problem's the opposite. I mean, at least from a European standpoint, there's so much emphasis now, you know, as if the problem is just a Death Valley one, as if it's just about commercialization, technology transfer, and they're really screwing things up. So, you know, they look at the US and they learn all the wrong lessons. So in the US, you had, you know, proper funding of research, dispersed, by the way. So UC San Francisco has Nobel Prize winners. It's not just about, you know, like in the UK, you know, 3 universities doing top-level research. You know, very dispersed, very well-funded research, where the universities were doing high-level, you know, blue sky research as well as some applied stuff, but early-stage technology development was done in companies. We are forcing European universities to do early-stage technology development, and the outputs are terrible. I mean, the Cambridge spin-out thing is not very good if you look at how much money is going in it and what kind of companies are coming out. You know, there's very small number of high-quality companies, and so getting that sort of innovative division of labor wrong, and at the same time of defunding science, and even if you protect your science budget, you don't protect your science budget, you increase it, because you live in a competitive world where China just increased it by 170% in the last 5 years. So, you know, you should be increasing it. So in the UK, actually in real terms, inflation adjusted, it's fallen by 15%. So you're pushing on a string with all this commercialization stuff.
What's your take on Silicon Roundabout? I just
Well,
wanted
I just
to say
wrote
Silicon Roundabout.
Well, read in The Economist, I wrote a long piece.
You did? Okay.
A week ago.
All right, I'll look it up.
Well, online. It's, I don't want to say against, it was putting in context all this technology startup
Okay.
special issue that they had
Online
and what's happening in the
Economist.
UK.
I'll look
Yeah.
for that. Final question, sir. I think you had your hand up.
Quick comment that I wonder if, first, I'm Robert Schroeder with International Investor. I spent a career counseling a lot of the boards of directors of these firms. I think we have to get away from this notion that there's American firms. I mean, maybe France can afford to do this, but we all know the boards and management teams are increasingly internationalized. The loyalty is no longer to the U.S. So this idea that we're going to help American brands, I think, is going by the wayside. But my real thought then is, should we start thinking from the beginning? I mean, the U.S. has had some experience now as a shareholder with GM and a few other companies recently. Should we consider that from the beginning, from the outset, in terms of when innovation is created within our agencies, that we create shareholder enterprises, and therefore when they are spun off to the outside world, the U.S. taxpayer continues to hold some ownership of them?
Good question to conclude with public stakes in successful enterprises.
You know, it's a very controversial idea, and you know, DARPA at one point considered this about 15 years ago, and it eventually led to the DARPA director being tossed out for even thinking about this. It's a very difficult proposition to put our government into a position of, and I hate the term winners and losers, but this may be the one circumstance where it's relevant, that it really does put the government into a posture of supporting particular firms as opposed to others. And that's a tough step to take. I think there are other important steps that we can take where there's a very significant payoff for the federal government. And indeed, you know, the IT revolution not only was a technology revolution, it was a revolution in tax returns to the United States. That's the traditional gain for the federal government. And structuring the tax system so that governmental rewards work and that the government supports innovation with the understanding that there's going to be tax rewards and a system for realizing those, and maybe even rethinking part of the R&D tax credit as part of that. I think there are the kind of steps that we ought to consider.
Very quickly, because I know we're out of time, there's actually a model that you may wish to investigate along those lines. It's a company called In-Q-Tel.
Yeah. Ruth was the leader in creating this.
It was spawned for a very different kind of reason. The original concept was to be a halfway house between government mission and the private sector where innovation was occurring. I was then head of science and technology at CIA, and there was a gulf between the two. And so looking for new models, In-Q-Tel was spawned, and actually it didn't come into being until after I was gone, so hands off and all that. But it was a corporation, a nonprofit corporation that was created to invest in a very targeted way in companies, particularly startups, who would build products of value to the mission. It's been around now for more than a decade. It's loved and hated in probably somewhat equal measures. There have been other attempts to replicate the model. Many of those have been put out of business. In-Q-Tel has successes and failures from its tenure, but it is still in existence. Its model has morphed over the years. It very rarely invested alone. It was usually a side-by-side investor with others. But if you want more, I think that's an interesting model because it does represent a case where the government, if you will, took ownership stakes because it was a funded entity, and the proceeds from its returns were reinvested in, again, trying to benefit the mission.
Can I just say something quick? So actually, we'll talk about my book now after promoting all these other books. The last 2 chapters of my book, I talk about that problem, right? This is a risk-reward thing. So if the tax system was working, in some ways, we wouldn't have to ask the question. And if there's hope to change the tax system, then we wouldn't have to talk about it. So that's depends on what we think the political space is there to talk about the tax system. But just given how things are now, this is a major problem, and tax is no longer taking care of it. But I wrote that book, and then I got an email from this guy at ARPA-E. I looked for him at the conference the other day, but he wasn't there. He said, "Be careful." He said, "You're being schizophrenic. You're saying one thing and then saying another. You're saying that on the one hand," he's saying to me, "you want this mission level stuff, think big, don't be like the private sector that does the cost benefit analysis, do the Sputnik thing. And then you're saying you want a return. So you're going to end up getting these guys in there doing the return analysis, which is going to constrain their mission thing." So that is a problem. But the potential solution, which then would require lots of work, I'm not saying it's easy, is to do both at the same time, which is you do the mission thing. You put, however, into these contracts, you say, look, if things go wrong, don't worry. You don't have to pay back, right? I mean, just like when, even with the grant, when Google got the grant to do the algorithm, if it had failed, it's not like they would have had to pay back more or less, whatever, right? So you do your thing, it'll probably fail, don't worry. If it goes well, okay, if and when it goes well, either with equity, but in the Google case, it wouldn't have been equity, but you pay something back, right? Why? Because if you don't, these funds, I mean, the evidence is the funds aren't being replenished. They just aren't. I mean, we could just pretend they are, but they're not being replenished. We could just print the money, by the way. Just read Minsky if you're interested in where money comes from. You could literally just print the money and do directed quantitative easing, but I don't think the political space is there anymore for that either. And if you can't do directed quantitative easing, and if you can't do it through the tax system, then these issues are important. And In-Q-Tel, absolutely. In Israel, they do this, I mean, with Yozma, it's public venture capital money. They do retain equity. But again, as I said before, in Finland, they do it too. It hasn't killed their innovation system. Finland today is one of the most innovative countries in the world.
On that note of QE, it's time to taper off this discussion. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Right, just couldn't resist it. The journalist. Wow. I haven't learned as much in 3 hours in a long time. So thank you to Matt and Benning. Really, really good session.